So I practiced this and I made, slip. Yeah, that was almost bad. But I did make it here to affectionately known as the MITRE, what was it, Gauntlet or Thunderdome?
Thunderdome's better.
Yeah, we'll see how violent this gets. But that said, thanks everyone for having me. Thanks, Sans, and shout out to the production crew, AV, everyone behind the scenes. Personally know how much it takes to put something like this together. So, you are not unrecognized. You folks are amazing. But I see a lot of friendly faces out here, a lot of familiar faces. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jamie. And as Sierra said, I am the lead for Attack for Enterprise. So I'll get into a little bit about that means in a little bit with some more formal introductions. But I love the talk before mine. It's actually, funny enough, we didn't plan this, there's no collusion here, but I did go with a little bit of a culinary theme, a very different flavor, doing it my own unique way, but shout out to the advisory committee. I think this is a really good setup. We're on the pathway to lunch. So good times. But this is actually a talk that I was a little bit, just being completely transparent. I had a little bit of imposter syndrome about this because I was like, is this like good enough for this audience? Is this going to be new? Is this me just like chewing on the same stuff that people have already heard? But honestly, actually putting it together, I am so excited to talk through this because, I think one of the big misconceptions that we very often have is, exactly like Gert-Jan said, like, other people are doing it this way. There's a certain way that I need to be doing it. Am I not enough? Am I not doing things the right way? And especially in the context of MITRE ATT&CK, you might see it all over the place. MITRE ATT&CK this, MITRE ATT&CK that. But really, what I really wanted to unpack today was like, what does that really mean? And more importantly, like, what value does that bring your team? But more importantly, like, how do you understand, are you doing it too much? These frameworks and these models are really great and they're a really good, model and kind of way of thinking about a problem and kind of structuring yourself for success. But again, don't let it overwhelm you because I love what Gert-Jan said. At the end of the day, it's the people, it's you. It's really, at most, something like MITRE ATT&CK or these other frameworks, they're co-pilots. MITRE, apparently I get probably cool points from the corporation for doing aviation analogies. So there might be a couple of those sprinkled in here as well. But again, let ATT&CK enable you versus take over your story. So without further ado, apparently I'm just full of gratitude today or whenever I made these slides. But one thing I just wanted to start with is, we love it. Even yesterday, today, people always come up to people who work on the MITRE ATT&CK team. There's actually some of us sprinkled around here and there, but people are always like, oh, we love the work. Thank you so much. But especially for this audience, I just wanted to take a chance to say, thank you. MITRE ATT&CK does not exist and really doesn't grow without you, because at the end of the day, really what we're doing is, my boss, Adam's over here, and he can vouch for this. We're not allowed to do a lot of original analysis, very little, if any. Like, my leash is super, super short here. But really what we're doing is taking the great outputs that you folks are putting together and really just kind of putting it into a structure that's a little bit easier to share and communicate and kind of spread the love. But at the end of the day, it's really all your work. So not to dismiss all the gratitude and appreciation, but I always like to start off most talks with just reminding you folks, like, you're amazing. This is all on you. We're just, happy and honored to even be a part of this. But as I said before, I went with a little bit of a culinary theme here for a lot of the same reasons. Chef Kiss, yep, I saw that. That was awesome. But a little bit of a different flavor. Wow, that was a weird pun. But you're basically thinking about, when I think about Intel, one of my favorite things, and it reminds me of food, is it's not just the output. There's so much history, there's so much context, there's so much depth. And you really, like, when you take a bite of a certain plate, you can almost taste the history, the passion, all of this rich nuance. And I think that applies a lot to Intel, where, I'm not a subject matter expert in any particular like region or any particular kind of threat actor. But that said, like, when you're looking at, so a geopolitical situation or a certain actor of a certain country, it's not just, I love the talks from yesterday that highlighted this, it's really not just the bits and bytes. There's so much deep context and so much nuance that really tells a much more complete story behind that. So that was a really long, weird rant for my justification to myself and you of why this is going to be very foodie, but also shout out again to the advisory committee for setting me up before lunch. So hopefully we'll build some hunger and work our way there. But In this menu format, we're going to start off with just foundational, talking about what you've probably already heard about attack. Why would you map your CTI to attack? What does that really get you? Just to kind of level set, I'm not going to do a complete attack 101. If you're interested in that, follow up with me later. Happy to kind of get you started, and you and your team, whoever that may be. But just to really get us going on, probably where you've already heard and what you've already kind of seen from, why would I take my data, map it to attack, and how does that help me, in an intelligence output perspective? From there, we'll go to the main course, which is really going to focus on more, what do I really want to tell you today? And I don't know who's editing the video later. Like, I'm probably going to do a lot of like analyst comments. Like, this is Jamie's opinion. So I will kind of go off my own personal experience here, but really just highlighting, pros and cons of, great opportunities to really, where attack can, again, add that value to what you're doing, but also some of those, for lack of a better word, oof moments where like, hey, I'm maybe going a little bit too mitery with this. I'm kind of losing myself in the attack, but mostly just making sure that I'm going to be really distracted because Ashton's awesome, and I'm going to be so interested in what this drawing looks like. But really just making sure you kind of have that soft balance of, making sure, again, attack is your co-pilot helping you be better and not, consuming or over, placing a shadow on your message. And finally, I don't really have much of a sweet tooth. If you were maybe paying attention to me a little bit yesterday, I did eat a Rice Krispie. It was awesome, but I'm not a monster. I will end with a little bit of a final bite just to kind of conclude this. But yeah, without further ado, just a little bit of background about the team I lead. As I said before, I am the lead for Attack for Enterprise. That is a very mitery way of saying I lead the team that writes techniques. Why that matters to you, back to another aviation analogy. This is a fun one. Basically, when I think about CTI and our team and what we can do for you, my goal is like air traffic control. Like, you're looking at data, you're looking at all these reports. I'm trying to get you into like whatever they do on the runway of like, this is where you land. Like, hey, this is confusing. Like, this malware is doing this or command line doing this. I want to help you find that technique and attack so you can kind of make that connection. But also, funny enough, like I said before, we don't do any original analysis. We're not going off and, downloading our own stuff and, doing our own IR. We're really depending on you. So the other hat that I wear is I am violently a consumer of all of your reports. Like, I don't want to put any metrics behind myself we're talking about metrics, but, I'm not going to guesstimate here. But on a typical day, I'm reading reports with a very particular eye, because, not to get away, I know there's a challenge for avoiding acronyms. Priority intelligence requirements, like I don't really have like, at least with the attack hat, I need to build detections or I need to help threat hunt. Really, with this lens on, I'm looking for new techniques. I'm looking for, hey, did anyone find anything that we haven't represented that we can help spread to other people? But also, I forget where Katie mentioned this, but somewhere in all the awesomeness that is Katie, she mentioned this really great idea of paying attention to other people and learning from them. So even if it's not relevant to what you're doing, how can I see what they do well or maybe not well and kind of learn from that? So one of the things that my application of that is very often when I'm looking at reports, I look at how are they using attack? How are they, we have some tools, we have some practices, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but how are they visualizing attack data? And especially being a little bit of an attack nerd, a little bit is probably a little bit, probably way generous. I am very much an attack nerd, but looking at how you map and saying, oh, that's a really interesting, I never would have thought of that mapping. We can help other people find that mapping, or like looking at what we would call mismappings of, I see what they saw, that data is really interesting. I don't think that's the correct mapping, and not just to dunk on them or like, oh, oof, you goofed, whatever, but really to understand how can I, as the air traffic control of the situation, alleviate that so that other people don't make that mistake. And I'm not gonna, write a letter or do anything in like super dramatic, but I take that as a failure on my part of, hey, we were here to help guide you and we kind of led you astray because maybe something we published wasn't super clear, the name wasn't right, whatever it may be. So where that gets us is, actually one quick disclaimer before we go any further. just wanted to start with, before we're going to start talking about the practice of mapping to attack, but also using attack to present information. One thing I really want to flint stomp here is use attack whatever the way works for you. Like at the end of the day, attack is here again as your co-pilot. If we have, guidance, we have, things we call out as mispractices or like, oh, maybe don't do that. But at the end of the day, it is a resource for you, whether you're doing, CTI, fronting, sorry, Andy, detection engineering, whatever it may be. Like I will happily give you advice. I'll happily give you guidance, happily give you feedback, but there is no right or wrong way. Jamie, analyst comment. I think whatever helps you get to where you need to be and communicate with your stakeholders, that is excellent. That said, like I said before, I'm gonna put you in the chef's kitchen a little bit here, and we're gonna go a little bit into the hype. What you've probably already heard attack, just to set as a foundation of like, where have you probably already been and kind of probably very close to the what we'll call the attack CTI 101. So if you've followed attack or used attack, one of the things you'll very quickly see is we have this term we call a common language. It is, Jamie comment, probably the most powerful thing about attack is that we can help, what it really establishes is a way for us to communicate with our stakeholders. And in this case, if you're an Intel analyst or wherever you are in your organization, sometimes it can feel like you're on a different planet than your stakeholders, especially if you're talking to detection engineers or executives or whoever it may be. You just use different language. You use different metrics, you use different jargon. The way you see the problem, the way you communicate it is so much different. And even if you're in a small shop, just to be more inclusive, like I've done this with myself, where I'm doing threat research and I'm doing all this like write-ups, I'm doing all this like, documentation. And then I put my like adversary emulation red team hat on. I'm like, I'm gonna do an emulation plan. And I'm reading my own notes. And I'm like, why did I go off on this long tangent about some election in the 80s? And like, why am I like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, what am I doing? So I think this is where you very often see that, almost immediate kind of draw into attack of, hey, in this case, I'm talking about a malware strain. Like, in the Intel world, we're throwing these terms around, the Tempest milkshakes and the irons and the numbers, all that stuff's great. And when it got Todd Bump, I guess there's my nod to naming conventions, but all that stuff's great. And, in our bubble, we may get that. But as you walk into an executive board or you walk into, a detection sprint or you go to, your architects or whatever it may be, those terms lose a lot of value. Like you can't just sling adversary names and malware names in those circles necessarily, especially if we're thinking about, shout out to the pyramid of pain. I don't have it in the slide, but especially if we're thinking about more robust, defensive strategies, it's a very easy and common response, especially as the slide shows, is like, hey, if you start talking to me about things that I don't understand, I'm going to try to simplify the problem. And like, hey, you're trying to talk to me about sock ghoulish, and there's this huge, thing we need to deal with, and I don't know what you're talking about. So like, can you just give me a hash? I don't like Intel person. You're confusing me. This isn't fun. Give me a hash or get out of the room. But really, what attack helps us do is say, okay, I know I can't talk to you about sock ghoulish, like as an Intel fanboy. But really what I can do is break that down and say, well, what we're dealing with is a drive-by compromise. Someone's posting nasty content on a website, our users are browsing to it, and then our browser spawning commands, whether it's JavaScript, Python, whatever. And again, that kind of connects that, that common language, those two perspectives come together where even a blue team or detection engineer is like, oh, that makes sense. I can see that in logs. I can see that in analytics. I can start to translate that to, okay, cool, I can actually act on that. So that's that very common, like, attack 101. I love this. Shout out to Adam and Katie for putting this together. This, I think, is really that pinnacle where if you're gonna take that first step and you're looking for that, like, why would I attack? Why would I do all this stuff? This is really that backbone. That said, I have absolutely been in the same experience. There's a lot of attack. Like there's, especially with, I'm showing you a matrix view right now. Fun fact, there is a third dimension. It goes deep. And I've absolutely been in the shoes. And like, funny enough, like I am personally accountable for this beautiful thing we're looking at, this matrix. There are very often times where someone will come to me and say, hey, can we talk about this sub technique or whatever this is? And I'm like laughing. I'm like, oh, like funny, like good joke. And then I'm like, oh crap, like you're serious. Like that's a real sub technique. I didn't realize we had that. Like, oh, sorry. Let me like actually get my brain aligned and figure out what we're talking about here. Like we did traffic duplication. That's awesome. Yay to networks and IaaS. But yeah, absolutely. The big point is like, it's not just you. There's so much attack. And the analogy I always think of, it's like a dictionary. Like you don't really need to memorize every word. You kind of learn things as they hit you in the face and as they're needed. Or, I guess maybe a more proper analogy is like, it's almost like learning a second language where you don't immediately start off with like, I need to memorize, I need to become fluent in a week. And like, I'm gonna pick up on every contextual term and be able to speak about poetry and current events and pop culture. It's like, oh, cool. Like, where's the bathroom? Can I have another beer or whatever it is? So with that said, this apparently is my like triage of slides that just dunk on attack for a little bit before we get to the good stuff. One of the also things that we noticed is like mapping to attack, even if you are very, very comfortable with attack, you've been using it for a while, it's also really, really hard and it's really, really easy to burn your food. So a couple, I'm going to post this in the resources channel in a little bit. But DHS CISA put out, I think apparently we're just like shouting out them all conference. I guess it's our local Intel overlords in the DC area, but they put out a really great guide outlining some common, mismappings, some kind of patterns. So I always like to highlight these as both as you're analyzing data, trying to make that mapping to attack, these are big things to keep in mind, but also, as you're producing data, think about how can I help my users not kind of fall victim of this. First one I always like to think about is leaping conclusions. These aren't as formal as like the analytic principles you'll typically see in some of the older doctrine, but especially relative to attack. Very, very common example of this is ports. How often do you see like malware uses port 80 or port 433 and you think, oh, cool, that must be web traffic. I'm going to map that to application layer protocol, web protocols. Look at that, I memorized techniques. I don't know the ID, P1071001. Like, oh, like port 80 must mean web. And this is potentially, again, a mismapping. Do you, as exactly as the definition is, do you actually have all the data that really validates that mapping? Because again, if you start to deliver this to a stakeholder, I'm looking through, non-denominational SIEM of your choice. I'm looking through my SIEM and I'm like, oh, like I don't see web traffic. Why did this report kind of lead me in the wrong direction? Second one, this is whoever's editing the video later, find the camera. Jamie comment, analyst comment. I think this is one of the most important ones. I see this all the time. I do it to myself all the time. Is missed opportunities. Jamie comment, I'm of the belief that most procedures are compound behaviors. You'll very often, rarely see adversary did blank and it only mapped to one technique. Good example is, adversary runs, our favorite command, who am I? And you're like, oh, cool, like system user owner discovery. Wow, that's two, awesome. Whatever that idea is. So you think of that mapping, but especially depending on who you're talking to a detection engineer or someone doing IR or someone thrunting, sorry, Andy, how they're gonna find that might differ of, oh, did they run it with PowerShell? Did they run it with Python? Did they do it with an API? That, these compound behaviors are gonna be really, really important, especially as we look at very, very common examples. And I think this even, I think Matt touched on this yesterday, and I unfortunately can't turn it off. I'm like watching someone present, I'm like mapping it in my head. I'm like, yeah, this is awesome. But a common example is adversaries maybe logged into a VPN. That's how they did initial access. Obviously, if you do like a string search, and you're like, oh, VPN access, there is I couldn't remember this one, external remote services and initial access and persistence. You're like, oh, cool, like an adversary has accessed our environment. That mapping makes sense. Those are almost one-to-one. I'm good. But and I think this is where we kind of put our critical thinking hat, not as attack users, but as Intel professionals of what does that imply? In this case, like I've used a VPN before, like there's authentication of some sort. So like even from now, like it's a little bit of an implicit mapping, but like, hey, I think there's creds here. I don't know if they're plain text. I don't know if it's a token, but like there's a little bit more I want to look into. And even alluding to the rest of Matt's talk yesterday, how'd they get the creds? Did they buy them? Did they steal them? Was it a data dump? Did they already access another environment and dump creds and there's a whole another matrix of mappings over here that now we're kind of in a second victim situation. But again, these missed opportunities are going to be really, really important in terms of, and I think this is one of my big points of using attack to kind of better carve out your story. We'll walk into a better example of that in a little bit, but I think this is one of those places where you really kind of like, look in the mirror and like, hey, this mapping process is actually helping me, it's not giving me answers, but it's helping me ask a lot of the right questions to really understand if I'm actually seeing this complete story. And final one, this is the one Jamie comment, personally take as like one of the biggest failures on us. And this is, I'm always very interested in feedback here, but just miscategorization of, this is just simply either, attack was too big and too many things going on, or the data just wasn't just clear. And I think a really, really common example of this is you'll look at a piece of malware and it'll say, oh, this malware can delete a file. And I'm like, okay, cool. Like mechanically, I understand what that means. Like it can delete a file. There's probably more details there, but as I map that to attack, I'm interested in anyone has any opinions here. Like, okay, there's two very, very clear and obvious potential mappings here. There is data destruction, which by name looks spot on we're talking about. Yeah, like you are deleting, you are destroying data. That makes sense as a mapping. But there's also, I'm going to not look at the slide, indicator removal, file deletion. That was the easy part. There's also that option. So you're like, well, what is the difference here? Like, and any guesses? Well, I'm not gonna, you don't count. I'm sorry, what was that? Yes, good point. So just for everyone online, the thought was, does it depend on if the adversary is deleting their own file or a file from the environment? I think this is amazing. That's a really good point. This is one of those points where, back to our food analogy, you end up with a big it depends burger. I think that is one of those ones that really carves that out. But it's also like, this is one of those things on us where it's like, hey, in terms of mapping to attack, A versus B is actually really, really important here. B is more defense evasion. It's in the defense evasion tactic. It's kind of more, hey, I'm cleaning up logs, I'm cleaning up something from the environment, kind of more to evade detection. A is completely different. It's impact. We're talking about, I'm going to avoid the acronym, computer network attack. We're talking about wipers, especially if you drew this out in a matrix, there's going to be that one cell on the far right that's highlighted. And if you brief that to audience, you're like, hey, this is an espionage, this is an attack. Like they're deleting data, they're trying to destroy the system. So again, there's a lot of context and nuance based on this very, very subtle thing. And I think this is one of those moments where you're like, diminishing returns start to catch up with me. Like, am I gonna spend an hour chasing this down? Am I gonna spend a day? Am I gonna spend a week? Am I gonna go check what kind of files are they deleting? Is it arbitrary file deletion? Are there hard-coded values? Full list of questions. But again, it's like, does it really, for what I'm doing right here, does it really matter? Is it that important? Maybe, maybe not. Again, I think this is one of those attack as your co-pilot, not your air traffic control leads you to success point. So that's more or less the foundational work. I know that was maybe a lot. I had a lot of fun with that. But with the next section, we're going to go into a little bit more like kind of a lot of the, again, Anna's comment and Jamie's opinion on stuff. And this is mostly just from my own experience helping with people, but also my own experience like using attack. I think that's one of the best parts and one of my favorite parts about my job is working on the attack team, but also like putting on another hat very often saying, I have to try to use this stuff. I'm in the trenches with you folks like, wow, that doesn't make sense. Or like, oh, like making this huge navigator file is a little bit annoying, like, or it doesn't communicate the way I want. So back to our cooking analogy, I respect Gert-Jan a lot for the process of curating and prepping and knife work and all that fun stuff. Probably a little bit of TMI. That's not me. I can cook 12 things, maybe baker's dozen on a good day. I am much more, I leave it to the professionals. Show me the ways. I'm more than happy to sit down in a restaurant and be wowed. But that said, in either direction, one of the lessons I've learned is all about the ingredients. It's all about the data. And if you have the right data, you can prepare the right dish, tell the right story. But really where attack helps you is actually being able to, in the spirit of this whole picture, understand what am I actually looking at. So I do probably have some prizes off to the side. We did one successful audience engagement, so I'm a little bit greedy. Let's do it again. Any guesses on how many techniques are in that? No wrong answers. Feel free to throw up some fingers. I think you have 10 fingers or somewhere in that vein. Probably more than enough, but any guesses? Roughly, I'll give you a sec to 7, 6, okay. 14. Oh, that'd be amazing. So I'm going to click through this just for the point of how many times in our Intel practice have we seen something like this? And shout out to the DFA report for publishing this. We see something like this and we're like, how do I communicate this to my stakeholders? And if I don't do, if I don't really break this down, I don't want to put the burden of analysis on someone, sorry, Andy, fronting or doing detection engineering or making procurement decisions, whatever it is. It's part of my job is to make that picture clear. And if I just copy and paste this and send this over to them, they're going to really have to piece this together. And honestly, I wouldn't blame them if they took the non-secular, non-denominational SEAM approach and just copy and pasted this, searched it and said, hey, I don't see it, so we're good. This adversary doesn't matter to us. Whereas really as Intel professionals, especially with that Copilot attack, what we can really do is start to pick this apart and saying, okay, cool, I see PowerShell. I see 2 types of lateral movement. They're using SMB, but they're also using some type of remote PowerShell execution. Is it DCOM? Is it WinRM? I don't know. Another point of diminishing returns. I can go test it in our environment, or I can just say I don't care. In this case, no offense. I was like, hey, you probably don't care as much as I do. We'll go with the parent technique. They're doing some type of file discovery. In this case, they're looking for a particular file, or they're doing a directory listing of a certain directory. And finally, last final bite here, credentials. Looks like they're using valid accounts through that environment variable. So that ended up being, what is that, 5 techniques? So I think a little bit less than we expected. But main point here is what it really, what attack is helping us do is break this down. And as we said, understand every bit of what's happening in that command line. And actually for every one of those, start to think about how should we act on this? Are there certain logs or certain processes or certain tools? But again, not going to be prescriptive of what that is, but what I can really do is start to see the problem here and saying, okay, now that I can actually see what's happening, I can communicate a little bit better on which parts of this can we defend and which parts maybe we need to take as a gap, a lesson learned, something improve in the future. And again, this doesn't just apply to process command lines and kind of very technical data. This also can be used for kind of more already structured data. So in this case, I'm not gonna overextend my welcome with the audience engagement here, but this is a really great excerpt from a recorded future post, basically highlighting, what is the China nexus of actors going to do in the future? What are we seeing? What do we kind of predict? And very similarly, you can start to pick this apart. And I'm going to be very cautious of not over-clicking here. That's it. But funny, what I thought was really interesting is we always think like, oh, technical data, oh, raw data has all the bits. There's actually more depth in this, just from mapping. And some of that's really, really subtle. Like I really hate myself for mapping use of to an entire technique. But in the context of what they're describing, I'm like, they're talking about creating tokens, but also using them. That maps the 2 techniques. So again, mostly just saying, as we start to look at how we analyze and perceive data, attack is really going to be that co-pilot for, are you actually decomposing and understanding what you're looking at? Like, and again, this could, my own personal experience, this is almost always an amazing feedback loop of as I'm looking at stuff and I'm like, hey, this looks like a behavior. The adversary is doing something. I can't map that. Maybe I should learn about what, Azure AD, or I'm sorry, Intra ID signing keys. I need to look into like what that is and kind of get familiar and hip with that space. So I think this is where the in-home dining versus the exterior, maybe a little bit bougier dining experience changes. I'm a sucker for plating. And I love this, I found this somewhere on the internet. I would 100% eat that. If you can plate a corn dog in like lunch meat, phenomenal. Like I'm hooked. Like tell me how much it costs. Yeah, I'm here for it. And I think this is also a really good analogy for, you don't have to be this huge global enterprise team of like, we have visibility across the whole world. Like that's great. That's phenomenal. Maybe your visibility is, hey, I go to my SOC and I go to my, non-denominational email filter, whatever that may be, and say, hey, what kind of spam are we getting? What kind of, what are users, flagging as phishing? Can I look at those payloads and maybe like put together a report of here's who I think is trying to phish us and here's what we need to look for in terms of post-compromise if anyone clicks on it. So it doesn't, not saying you're a corn dog of an Intel shop, but just saying I think there's a lot of value for whatever data you have if you understand how to actually present that to your stakeholders. So getting back to this example, really, I think this is super neat. I was like, I love this graphic. I'm going to use this all over the place. Sorry, MITRE people in the room, you probably already seen me like rant about this internally, but realistically, you can't just send this to your audience. You can't just slam this on an executive's desk, can't just slam this on your front team or detection engineer and like, good luck. Like this is a really neat working product within our bubble of like Intel professionals. This isn't finalized. And very often, not to dunk on anyone, I think, again, back to the disclaimer, use attack whatever works for you. The simple method of just summarizing, like, here's the techniques I saw, like, this kind of isn't it either. Because again, I've done this to myself where I've read a bunch of report, wrote down all the technique IDs, and then I go to emulate it and I'm like, Jamie, what are you doing? Like, I can't capture the nuance of this adversary. I can't build detections based on just labels. Like that's a good start. It's not useless, but it really doesn't give me everything I need to get to where I want to go. Fun fact about me is I do think in memes, unfortunately. So indulge me. I'm gonna take a sip of water while you enjoy this one, but I could not let myself present without including this slide. Not gonna explain, it's self-explanatory. So again, now we're thinking, we've used attack to see our story. And we're starting to like, oh, I see what's happening here. I actually see the data. And I'm thinking about, how do I actually get this to my audience in a way that gets their mouth to drool? Like I want them to like, whether it's a corn dog, Wagyu filet, whatever it is, I want them to really be excited about this. And more importantly, see themselves in it. Like, no, this isn't an Intel product. This is a you product. This is for you. Like I catered this 100% for you. So, first step here is thinking about your audience. Like, hey, I wish I could credit this to one person. I love the analogy of Intel as decision support. And I think as you're starting to get into this point where we're packaging this up, like, think about like, what decision am I trying to influence here? Like, is it a procurement decision? Is it a front? Is it an analytic development? Is it just, let's identify this gap? Or I'm just telling a good story. Like, I'm just here to kind of tell exactly what this adversary did. And then as we start to decompose that, thinking about like for that decision, what context is valuable? Like, do they need, full everything? Do they need a quick summary? Do they need it visually? Do they need it in a spreadsheet? And that kind of gets us to this last point about format, where don't be afraid of playing around with different, like experiment. That's why I said before with my attack lens, I love when people do, like we have Navigator, we have a couple other tricks. I love when people do their own thing, like play around. Like let's figure out, how can I most effectively with my presentation style, but also my audience, how can I make this lesson and these, this message really actually land? Kevin, very, very mandatory office meme. And I think this is where, especially as I like making PowerPoint slides. I'm like, one of the last things I do is like, I think about my story, I think about message, and I'm like, don't fumble the bag, Jamie. You have it, just put it together, try to capture the story in some fun way. And getting back to that, like, there's so many different ways to present attack data. Like very common, like example like this is like, hey, I took those 5 techniques, threw them in a Navigator layer. Like that's pretty. I could walk in front of most audiences and feel confident, like I can talk to this. But does this really, getting back to that previous point, does this capture all the context? Like, with just that view, like I think we're showing some interesting things in terms of like, hey, this is what the adversary chose to do versus what they didn't. Maybe in this context, if I have like timestamps, I can draw like, oh, they did this and this and this, and show a little bit of progression. A couple fun ideas we can do here. I maybe even do blowouts. But, really, this is just an idea. Like, I think we very often see this like notion of like, oh, thou shalt use attack navigator, when very often that might not really be what your audience needs. So there's a couple terms for this. I know like procedure, context, observables, whatever it mean. I'm a big fan of this, like especially as a working product. Just like, hey, it's almost like I think Andy said yesterday. Show your work. Think about like, okay, for every one of those mappings, justify it. You mapped PowerShell. Why? What did you see that made you think about PowerShell? You mapped file and directory discovery. What did you actually see? That not only helps deliver a better message, but it keeps you honest of like, did I actually see, why did I stop at remote services and not go to DCOM or WinRM? Why did I think the parent technique was appropriate here? And this is where you get to that kind of almost general intel practice of, hey, understanding what I see and what I don't see. But big point here is, again, don't forget to show your work. I think very often we'll see people like make a table like this and deliver it. We attack even do it. You'll go to the site and we kind of summarize and abstract a lot of information. But honestly, like thinking about this example, without that original command line, I almost have to reverse engineer what the original data was. I'm like, I have to look at this entire table, and I've done this a million times, scroll into the report, read the table, and I'm like, I kind of get the silhouette of what happened here. But honestly, like I have to still go back and read the entire report because I don't get flow and context and meaning and connective tissue, all these behaviors. So again, I'm trying not to be prescriptive here, but it's also just interesting to think about how do I actually make sure I'm giving both sides of the story, and again, not letting attack overwash and overwhelm all this data that I'm analyzing. And finally, finishing. We got our dish, our ingredients prepped, we got everything beautified, plated. We got to do a little salt and garnishes on the side. And I think this gets back to one of my favorite words in Intel: actionability. Giving maybe, and depending on your background, your audience, give them maybe a push in the right direction. How do I want you to think about this data? What am I actually trying to get you to do? And how can I kind of start to nudge you in the right direction in terms of, hey, I saw a lot of PowerShell, maybe we should look at PowerShell logs. I saw this, maybe we should look at that. I am very sad that I didn't get to make the first 100% attack coverage joke at the summit, but this is also the point where I check myself and I'm like, hey, the objective of this isn't to flex, hey, look how awesome I can map all this data to attack, but also more importantly, I'm thinking about my audience of like, I'm actually trying to influence decisions. And if some of this is a distraction, like in this example, like, hey, I know what they're gonna go do with this data. They can't really act on this data. Like we don't have the visibility here. We don't have the tools, we don't have the process, we don't have the staff. Maybe I don't include it. If I'm just trying to tell the story of like, here's everything the malware adversary did, that's one thing. If it's Thursday afternoon, we don't do hunts on Friday. It's Thursday afternoon and I'm like, the team's stressed and we're like, hey, we got to get this done. Maybe I pull some punches. I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to bore you with a lot of details that don't matter to you. But either way, we're kind of in this space where like, we're really getting to that. We got the data decomposed. We analyzed it. We figured out what we see and what we don't see. We got our intel gaps and our questions. And we have that actionability, like final stint on like, what are we actually trying to do with this data? So just wrapping up, probably the worst dessert you'll ever be served, but just kind of summarizing this, like, I think as we look at attack and how we can actually use it in our intel production, we really have to be very mindful of that balance of, what actually brings value to me versus when am I maybe kind of getting overwhelmed with this whole MITRE ATT&CK thing and, there is a point of diminishing returns. So just a couple of big points that I want to highlight on the positive side. Absolutely use attack as we talked about to see your story. What does this data actually mean? What is it? What are the actual underlying mechanics of what's happening? Do I understand all those bits? And then more importantly, how can I communicate that out to my audience? How can I better highlight the right things and maybe put a shadow on the wrong things? But also, whether it's Navigator, these tables, whatever it is, one of the most interesting things about this process is you create repeatability, where a lot of your products look very similar. Whether you're a Navigator person or a table person, your audience will appreciate that kind of repetition of like, oh, I'm comfortable with this format and I know where things generally will be. And then, that kind of downside of always be mindful of, again, MITRE analogy, shout out to the corporation. Attack is your co-pilot. you're really the star of this show. You're telling the story. It's your narrative. Attack is really just there to help you. Wow, I could not have finished more on time. That's awesome. But thanks again. We will be around if anyone has questions. And if anyone also wants in person, sorry, online people, tax stickers, we have a table full over here. So pop over. But with that said, thank you so much. And Merry Summit. Oh, we do. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I'm gonna take a sip of water then.
Thank you so much, Jamie. That was awesome. And Jamie not only is an amazing speaker, but he has hyped all of the other talks and speakers up so much in person and on Twitter. So thank you for that. Just wonderful. But we do have time for a couple questions. So based on thumbs up, I'm going to start with, do you all at MITRE have a list of commonly miscategorized techniques? And if not, that might be a helpful resource or blog to consider.
Ooh, love that question. So we don't index that. I think Jamie comment. I think a lot of us have that between our ears for our own experience. Like I know there's things that I very commonly see, but we do have a tool that we co-published with DHS called Decider, where basically it is a mapping platform where you can create your own mappings of like, hey, I'm looking at this report, I'm mapping this, mapping that, and it actually exports into a Word doc with a table or everyone's favorite tool, an Excel sheet. But more importantly, it's also a knowledge management platform where you can say, hey, if you were reviewing someone else's mappings, I think you misrepresented this, or you maybe missed the mark here, or there's a missed opportunity here. Let's capture that, and it'll save those, and it actually publishes them or saves them internally as analyst notes. So you can go and look at like, here's our lessons learned, whether it's over the week, month, forever. So I wish we could be more prescriptive universally, but I think that's a shop-to-shop, analyst-to-analyst problem. But we do have a little bit of tooling to accommodate that line of thinking. But that is the right line of thinking, so great.
Awesome. And along the lines of tooling, are there any plans to upgrade Attack Navigator to be quicker or easier to use for formatting presentations?
I should not have taken a sip of water. Yes. I'm sorry, Jared. I'm going to do my best to represent the Attack software team here. Yes, generally, across the board. We have a team that's dedicated to looking at the usability of Navigator, or again, we're always very interested in how people are using it and how we can maybe mimic and enable some of those features. I think my best advice there is all this stuff we're talking about is open source. Check out the Attack Navigator GitHub repo, submit an issue, submit an idea of like, it'd be really cool if, and our amazing lead, Jared, will follow up with you. But yes, I'm happy to share pro tips on how I'm happy to share tips, how I do stuff, but Navigator can be a lot of fun.
Awesome, thank you. So in terms of feedback for Attack, is there a plan to kind of streamline gathering community input when it comes to Attack?
Yes, informally. The best advice I can give you is reach out to us through the alias. Honestly, you're talking to some of the people you're seeing in the room, just on the other side of an email alias. And even if it's like, hey, again, it's really hard to map this technique. I don't think you captured that right. Or if not even a full contribution, just like, hey, I'm not a big fan of the way you did this. That's really valuable to us. Like, obviously we get a lot of input, so I can't promise like itemized feedback within a certain period of time, but those insights, whether it's through the alias, we have a public Slack, tap our shoulder while we're here. Like, that's, again, I take it very personally that it's not this is a really weird thing to say. It's not MITRE's MITRE attack, it's our MITRE attack, if that makes any sense. So like, again, I'm willing, especially as the, I guess, shepherd of the enterprise matrix, like I'm willing to consider anything that helps you folks use Attack more efficiently.
That's awesome. And so last question, and thank you all for posting in Slack. I guess last question, I'll open it up to anyone in the audience. Give some FaceTime. I think we have one back there.
Hey, Jim, really appreciate the talk. I'm curious more from so this platform or this framework really works from a report perspective. Like I read a report and I can map it, but from a collection or from a data storage, large data science perspective, I guess I want to hear your perspective of like, how can we store this information somewhere instead of not just on a spreadsheet, but say I have 10 reports that all talk about the same MITRE technique or ID.
Yeah.
Instead of me reading all those 10 reports, what have you seen with your approach of getting through that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And honestly, that's something we're focused on is like, how do we automate and kind of scale this? It's a little bit tricky because, as I showed, like mapping things to attack is like very nuanced. We've played around. I know other folks have played around with like trying to automate some of that. In terms of storage, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Like even we saw one yesterday with Roberto and Thomas of like how we look at like, ideas of groups and like, decompose them into, YAML, wherever it is, and then kind of, aggregate that at scale and work on it. So we don't really have a prescriptive guidance there. I would say just think about like whatever makes sense for you, like whether it's JSON, YAML. But my big, foot stomp there would be it's really easy, especially when you think about like data engineering, to like cut corners and be efficient of like, oh, I'm just going to save the technique IDs. And I think you fall victim to these same traps I was talking about of like, don't lose the context, don't lose the original source, because without that, a year from now, you're going to be looking at that same data and like, oh, I just have like a pile of technique IDs and like, I can't really use this. Like it's interesting. I can maybe put some pictures and do some overlaps, but like it's not as actionable as one would think. So again, I unfortunately can't give you like this is exactly, but it's more kind of think through what are you actually trying to achieve? And again, how can attack enable that, but also use attack to capture, store, structure that context. I know people played around with sticks and JSON YAML, but definitely don't want to like put you in a box. Like be very creative with that problem. And again, if you find out something really interesting, I'm more than happy to kind of hear and we can maybe propagate it to more folks.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.